All right, so it's good if you're new to this class because we're sort of starting from scratch, but not entirely, but it's a new topic. So you won't be like lost. I mean, you might be lost, but I'm lost too, so you don't have to worry about it. So basically this year, the class has sort of been about creation, the doctrine of creation. Sort of went through that in the first half. And now I'm sort of going to focus on the first chapter of Genesis, Genesis 1, because we're leading up to the discussion about creation and evolution. But before I think we get there, we have to sort of talk about what creation actually says. I mean, what Genesis actually says about creation. So a lot of questions last year were sort of leading to that. Like, well, what do you think this meant in like Genesis 1, blah, 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 etc. So I decided to just do this. So I got some handouts. You don't have to take one. You can if you want to. You can take notes if you want to. Maybe in 5 years, Dave will give a test on all my classes. I don't know. I'm not going to give you a test. So what we're doing now is this. I call this interpretations of Genesis 1. And I say plural because there are many interpretations of Genesis 1. And I actually think there are many that are perfectly valid and fine to have as a Christian. So I'm sort of going to go through the ones that I think you can have as a Christian that are perfectly fine to have. Now, I've always sort of stressed that, not to be too dogmatic in your beliefs, and that's why I'm sort of doing this, be open when things aren't like critical to like your salvation or to Christianity. As I've discussed many times, there are essential beliefs, and they all center around Jesus Christ. So this is sort of just the fluff and the fun. Sorry, God, for calling it fluff. So again, I ended last year with reading Genesis 1, and I think I want to do that again. I know it's kind of a lot for me to read. And I know they always say don't stand in front of a group of people and read something, but maybe Adam can put it up and you can read along. But I'm going to read Genesis chapter 1. So this is the American New Standard Version. Thank you, Bill. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the water. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse. And it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning, a second day. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing the fruit with seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a third day. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. And he made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Then God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens." God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." There was evening and there was morning, a fifth day. Then God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, cattle and creeping things, beasts of the earth after their kind." And it was so. God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything that creeps on the ground after its kind, and God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the seas, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Then God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed. It shall be for food for you, and to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth which has life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. So there's Genesis 1. So before we sort of get into the interpretations of this, when you're interpreting any type of literature, and if you were here last year, I sort of hinted at this, you're practicing what's called hermeneutics. That is sort of the science of interpretation. So in order to interpret any sort of type of writing, there's like a couple rules you should follow. You want to sort of interpret something based on its literary type. So you want to determine the type of literature it is. You have fiction, nonfiction, biography, fantasy. You don't want to sort of read one thing that's intended one way and interpret it another way. So as I've sort of brought off last year, when we read in Psalms where it says, "Let the trees clap their hands before the Lord," like the author there is not a botanist. He's not like giving a botany lesson. He's not teaching like this should be in a botany book. That's a metaphor. The other thing that's critical is the author's intent with what he was writing, and also the understanding at the time. Now, what this sort of means is you want to read a text and examine it on its own merits first. Like sort of what was the author intending in this, and who was also going to be reading it, and how would they interpret it? Like who was the message for? And, a lot of counterpoints to this is like, well, it was for us too, and that is true, but when you're first starting the study, the first thing is to say, what was the author trying to say, and who was he trying to say it to? Like when you read Paul's letters, you have to keep in mind who he was writing to first, when you're studying those letters. I've brought up the words like exegesis versus eisegesis. What exegesis and eisegesis is that, taking interpretation from something or inserting your own interpretation. You want to avoid doing that. So, that being said, I went over a lot more last year, but I just wanted to give a brief refresher. So the first thing we're going to do is go over the very first interpretation I want to go over. And this, I think, is the most simple, not the most simple, but the most common. And it's called the literal interpretation, or what's more commonly known as the 24-hour day interpretation. Now, this actually takes sort of two forms in like modern theology or modern study. So the first one I'm going to go over is put forth by these two German theologians. One is Gerhard von Rad and Wolfhart Pannenberg. Now these guys are both 24-hour day interpreters. They're theologians. But what they say is that the author or authors of Genesis 1 were expressing scientific view of the time. That this is sort of a primitive scientific expression of what they believed creation to think. So they're basically saying that the author meant it as it is written, that it was a 24-hour day period. That's how God created it. And that was how they understood it in the science of the time. Now, different than what you might think of this type of view is that they then think that he was just wrong. Like he was wrong in his science. Like modern science has now sort of shown that his reading of it was wrong, but it doesn't take away from like the theology of the chapter. So, they'll say science has clearly changed. If you're new to this class, I take a lot of drinks of water, so I'm not good at talking too much. So the point, though, they're trying to make is that the author was actually intending to merge science and theology in writing this chapter, that he was trying to make a scientific study of creation. That's what the narrative is. And they just say that it was wrong. And now this is in contrast with the other view, which is commonly known as the young earth creation or young earth creationism. And they would agree, or this view agrees with the two German theologians, except they disagree in that they still think the account is correct, that the science behind the account is correct. And what they'll say is this text should be taken at prima facie, or face value. Like, you read the text that was written, and that's what it means, and that's the way it's supposed to be taken. That's what I mean. It's sort of the simplest interpretation. It is the face value interpretation. So now the question for us that we're going to be studying in this is that, should the text be taken this way? Should it be taken as face value? Should it be taken literally? Is this the way the author intended it to be taken? And is this how it would be understood at the time? Now, going back to Von Rad and Pannenberg, they actually, like, in their books, they wrote a book just called the Old Testament Theology, Volume 1. And that's in there. They don't actually give any evidence for this view that the author was intending it scientifically. They don't have any other texts from the time. I don't even know if science was really a word you could use like 4,000 years ago. So it's they just sort of state it, like, I think because their goal was to say that even the authors of the Old Testament were trying to merge science and theology, because that was a big goal of theirs. And in a way, it's a goal of mine too, and a goal of this class. But as I said, that shouldn't be the first thing we do. I'm not. You might assume that I'm going to say use modern science and bring it back into this to argue against some of these things, but that's not what I'm going to do. I do think that is a good thing to do. We should look for a synthesis between science and theology, but when you're studying the Bible, that's not the first thing you should be doing. So, any sort of questions or comments about like the literal interpretation of what it actually means? Don't bring up any objections or anything yet, just sort of questions or comments.
I was actually just wondering if, so you're saying that the 24-hour philosophy or idea, interpretation theology is the same as young Earth creationism? In other words, the people who are young Earth creationists typically take Genesis at face value?
Yes.
Okay.
Typically when someone describes themselves as a young Earth creationist, they would take the 7-day creation period. I mean, they might not, but then still call themselves young Earth because maybe they believe that it, or maybe the belief is that it's still only like 5,000 to 10,000 years old.
Okay.
But usually they go hand in hand. Usually, because it's based on sort of the timeline. Like if everything was created in 7 days, and then you sort of can move forward from that, then it gives you about like a 10,000 year time period. So, okay. Before I sort of get into the defense, I'm going to do a defense and sort of objection to all these interpretations. So before I sort of get into the defense of the literal interpretation, I sort of want to make some side notes that most evangelical biblical scholars today and would say that the narrative of Genesis 1 is sort of a unique piece of literature, and that's even literary scholars who are not evangelical scholars think the same way. It doesn't fit into any sort of one type of ancient type of literature. It's not strictly just poetic. It's not strictly just metaphorical. It sort of is this weird combination. It has a very metered way. It's, God said, God made, of this kind, of that kind. It follows a pattern. It's the number of lines and words are actually very important in the Hebrew version. So it sort of has, they call it what's called like a figurative history, or it's written in a figurative historical way. And what they'll mean is that it is telling us historical events, but in sort of a figurative way, like a metaphorical way. So a lot of these scholars, and now these are not people who necessarily hold to the literal interpretation, would not press the word yom, which is the Hebrew word for day, to be a literal 24-hour day. They would say, think of the word yom as the same way we use the English word day. Like when you say day, it doesn't always have to mean a 24-hour day. It can, but you could say like, oh, back in my day when we used to have to walk to school, or back in Abraham Lincoln's day, where you're not talking about it in that way, but then you can use it as a 24-hour day. It's a very flexible word. So they would say it's it's not necessarily that this is meant to be taken as a 24-hour period. And there's a lot in here that is very figurative, but yet they're not denying the historical accuracy of what is sort of going on. And I mean, I fall somewhere in there, but towards the end of all this, I'll tell you sort of my views. I sort of cross interpretations, and it could change next year. So here we go. One of the, well, first of all, if you're holding to this view, you can sort of just make the defense that you don't need to defend this view. Like, it's up to other people to object, because at face value, you're reading what it says. This is written to be read as days, 7 days, 6 days, 7 days. So it's basically up to people who object to this to prove otherwise, that it's not meant that way. So that's sort of the first response you can have. And that's, I don't really have a response to that. That's a pretty good defense, A pretty good proof. I don't want to say defense, But one of the key verses in the Bible that sort of points back to this is in Exodus 20, and it's verses 8 to 11. So let me read that. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant, or your or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day, etc. So the line I want to sort of really focus on is, so it says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. So the defense here is that the people who wrote Exodus, or maybe it's the same person, is sort of understanding the Genesis 1 story to be 6 days. Like, he's referring to it back that way. So that's the way we should interpret it when we read it. Any questions or comments about that? Yes.
Isn't it believed that Moses wrote Genesis? Ben?
Used to be, but now it's not. No. So, we don't really know. They're sort of thinking it was written in Babylon about 2,000 years before Christ. Actually put down into words, like paper. Sort of the Genesis chapter 1 and 2, especially, those stories go back a long time. They sort of trace them back, like, for a very long time. As I talked about last year, like the oral history, there's some views that this story might be like 35 to 40,000 years old. But they think it was actually first written down about 4,000 years ago. If it was Moses, you can't say if it was sort of edited a little bit. The reason I think it was sort of changed a little bit is because it really resembles in form the Babylonian creation story. And so that's why the predominant view right now was written by Jews living in Babylon. Jewish scribes living in Babylon were sort of decided to put it down into paper. So hopefully that answers your question a little bit. I'm not saying it's not Moses, so you just don't know. So that's the big defense of the 6-day literal interpretation. So if nobody sort of wants to talk about it, I can say some problems I have with that defense. I just don't think it's that clear cut. I think what the verse in Exodus is really focusing on is the Sabbath and observing the Sabbath. And it's sort of pointing at the pattern of how a Jew is supposed to live his life, sort of the 6th day and then you rest, the 6th day and then you rest. And I think the key is that in the 7-day creation, that on the 7th day, like when God rests, like the 7th day hasn't ended. When you go into chapter 2, every day ends, there was evening and there was morning. There was evening in the morning. On the 7th day, it never gives that. So it can be read that like God is still in his Sabbath and sort of, it's waiting for the Sabbath to end. And, that is also sort of hinted at in Exodus 31, I think, where God talks about the Sabbath. God is in his Sabbath, and it represents the covenant to his people, that God is an eternal covenant. So, for me, like a literal 24-hour day in the week of the life of a Jew, but yet the Sabbath day of creation doesn't necessarily mean 24 hours. It's like, why then should the other ones be taken to mean 24 hours? As I said, it's like we observe the Sabbath, or we're meant to observe the Sabbath as a sign of like God's covenant, just like communion. You know, we practice communion to remember Christ's promises, you know, and it's, again, the thing we sort of criticize or had criticized the Catholic Church for was like, no, it's not literally the body and literally the blood of Christ. And I think the Sabbath can sort of be represented, could be understood in the same way. You know, it's not literally just 24 hours that this represents. But again, most people, when it's sort of pressed in debates, that is the verse, the Exodus verse. And I think, like I said, it is a pretty good proof. It is a pretty good verse. I just don't think it's like 100% convincing. I think there's other ways to read into it. The other main one is that in ancient Hebrew, when the word yom is followed by a number, that it only references a 24-hour day. There is a problem again with this, is ancient Hebrew only has about 8,000 words. Now, in comparison, modern English is like 170,000 words. So it's like you're very limited in sort of what we can sort of read into it. You know, we have to use a lot of other texts that we have, which we don't have a lot of ancient Hebrew texts. So again, it's the fact that the word yom is followed by a number represents a 24-hour day just could be because we have a limited amount. Like, we don't have enough for comparison. It's hard to make that judgment when you only have a couple verses that are like that. But the other thing is that it's just, there is an example of yom and a number that doesn't represent that. And this is in Zechariah. So in Genesis 1, verse 1, when it says day one, the word is yom ehad. And that's day one in Genesis 1. In Zechariah, the same phrases were used, called Yom Ehad, but that is translated as the day of the Lord, which we don't take to mean just one 24-hour day. So again, both those words, there is an example of the number following the word Yom, and it's not referencing a 24-hour period, as Zechariah says. So again, it may not seem like much, but as I said, oh, Tommy. I haven't gotten to objections yet.
Oh, you haven't?
No.
Oh, okay. I'm going to hold off then.
Keep the microphone.
It never says in Genesis that a day is 24 hours. It just says it's a day.
Yeah.
And they don't even had the concept of an hour. So all they knew was the sun rose in the east, and that was the start of the day. Well, and they didn't even know the earth was round. So, I mean, how do we know that they're even referring to a 24-hour period of time?
Yeah, we don't. Okay. I mean, that's I'll get to this stuff.
Okay.
But I just wanted to say, can other people think of other good reasons? And I'm not saying other good, like, oh, give me a good reason. I'm saying, like I said, I think this is a valid view to hold as a Christian, as a literal, but, you know, I've only really presented like 3 sort of proofs for that. If anyone sort of thinks of other ones they have, or maybe you hold to this view and why you hold to this view, you can talk about that too. But like I said, I want this to sort of be very open and very welcoming, and I don't want to be like some young earth creationists where they call people who don't hold to young earth creationists like, you know, you're a compromising unbeliever, you know, basically.
In a literal interpretation class that I took, the teacher was telling us that the reason you have to take this as literal is because as a literal 24-hour day, which of course makes you believe in young Earth, is because you would be able then to take any scriptures you want and interpret them, you know, and you know, change them to your liking. You know, if you open it up here, you have to open it up everywhere.
Well, I mean, I sort of disagree with that, because when we say day, like, we're not changing that to mean anything. It still means a period of time. You know, it's not like we're taking day and turning it into some like moral belief on sexuality. You know, the word is still confined to like this period of time. Like it still represents creation and it still represents time. So I sort of disagree with that perspective a little bit, you know.
I do too, because the Lord says that a day can be as 1,000 years. And so now I forgot what I was going to ask you. Oh, okay. So it doesn't actually say 24/7 or anything like that.
No.
And when God created, it was in eternity, and eternity doesn't have time.
No.
So where did the word day come from?
I mean, the Hebrews. I mean, they ancient Hebrew actually meant it as, you know, it's written, I'll sort of talk about this more, as there was evening and there was morning. So they already think of it differently than we do. And to them, the Sabbath starts at night. You know, the day of the Sabbath starts at night. So it's already sort of a different understanding than we even understand it today.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like how, I think Dave said it, it's just, they didn't really have a clock. They just remember, oh, the sun comes up, the sun sets, you know, and then we get on with, but to them, I think the thing to emphasize to them was the pattern. It was all about the pattern. You know, you have to rest after 6 days because you're sort of remembering God, you're honoring God, you know. So, you know, maybe that was moved sort of, they took that pattern and that's the way they wrote it like this to sort of represent their daily lives. But again, that's just me sort of talking about my thoughts. I don't. All right, so anybody else? All right, I'm going to get into what Tommy wants to talk about because he's got his phone out. So I want to then get into the objections to the literal interpretation. And as I said, I'm not doing what I said we shouldn't do. I'm not going to take modern science and insert modern science into it and say like, well, you know, science tells us the universe is this old, so therefore this cannot be true. Now I'm going to keep it within the text that is given, and I don't actually think I'm going to go that much outside of Genesis 1 to object to this. So given the literal interpretation, let's even say that the author did mean a 24-hour day. Let's say he did mean that. That still doesn't mean it's not a metaphor. You know, that still doesn't mean it's meant to represent something else. You know, take, for example, the word arm in the English language. Like, arm means your limb, also means a weapon. Now, it talks about a lot, or maybe not a lot, but, you know, it talks a lot about the arm of the Lord is for the people of Israel, or the Lord uses, the arm of the Lord covers the people of Israel, the arm of the Lord, the arm of the Lord. Now, the author wants you to think of an arm, like, you know, he's using a metaphor of an arm, but he's not saying that God has a literal appendage. It means like God's power or God's protection. But the metaphor is meant to be interpreted as a limb, like God's arm is protecting his people. So again, the author could mean a day, like a 24-hour day, but it could still be a metaphor, even given the fact that it is a 24-hour day meant to be that. So that's sort of to start. Now, the other objections I have are actually, oh, the clock's back there, are actually in the text itself. I think that the author sort of gives us hints to this not being a little 24-hour day in actually what he's writing. You know, I sort of hinted at like the Sabbath day doesn't end the way the other days does. As I said, like every day ends with the phrase, it was evening and it was morning. The second day, it was evening, it was morning, third day. Now, something that has troubled a lot of interpreters for a very long time is that the sun and the moon aren't created until the fourth day. So how do you have evening and morning on like the first day, the second day, the third day when there was no sun? Now, people who interpret this literally, the young earth creation especially, already will change the way they read it to say that, well, the sun and the moon were there, they were just hidden. I'm like, so you're already changing like how you're reading it is what you're criticizing us for doing. And so, again, they're already starting to do that. So again, that's, like I said, that question isn't like a new question of like, well, how is there, like this goes back to like the early church fathers were wondering about like, well, the sun and the moon weren't created, so how do we have these days? And so there's that. Also in Genesis 1, if you go to verse 11, luckily I kept it open. Verse 11 and 12 I'm going to read. Then God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind with seed in them." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them after their kind. God saw that it was good. Now, notice that it says that the earth brought forth vegetation. It says, God says, "Let the earth bring forth vegetation." And then it says, the earth brought forth vegetation. In other places it says, God said and God made. But here it's the earth is actually sprouting the plants, sort of coming up from the ground. Now, like we know how long it takes. Well, I don't know exactly how long it takes, but when you plant an apple tree, like it takes time for that to happen. It takes time for it to grow, be able to bear fruit and give seeds, and this was a science that the ancient Israelites did understand. They were agrarian. They knew how long crops took to grow and how to till the land and how to get seeds and how to give it forth. Now, to think that this was just one day, you'd have to assume that the author was sort of in his mind's eye visualizing what we know as like time-lapse photography, like something that's like fast forwarded and stuff. And someone like 4,000 years ago, I don't think has that like sort of type of imagination as he's writing. He thinks that this has happened. Like, no, he knew what it took for a crop to grow and for what this to happen. It does talk about how the earth is doing this. It's like God sort of said to the earth, start doing this. And it sort of started happening, brought forth vegetation. He didn't mean it happened in a 24-hour day, at least to me. They understood the seasons. They understood like when to plant and how long it would take. And this was very important to them. And again, in Genesis 1, if you go to the 6th day, describes sort of the creation of man. Creation talks about made man and woman, in our image. Now, this is mostly just about Genesis 1, but I am going to go to Genesis 2 a little bit. Now, Genesis 2 then sort of focuses on Adam, and it talks about Adam and all the things he sort of did. And, it was like naming all the animals. And basically, I'm an imaginative guy. I think about Adam, like chilling with all the animals, hanging out with them. Maybe he sort of gets to know the way certain ones are, and that's how he names that certain one. And it sort of talks about like God saw that none of these animals were good companions for him. So then God puts Adam to sleep and then creates Eve in the story. Like, you want me to think that happened in a day? Like that this all happened in a day? Like Adam got really bored of the animals like real fast. And was just like, all right, God, come on. I'm lonely here. Give me something. And it's even in Genesis 2:23, it says, like Adam says, this at last is bone from my bone. Like at last. Like, and so in 12 hours, he was already like, ugh, come on. And it's funny, that phrase at last is used by, I think, Jacob when he's finally able to leave Laban. I think it was 14 years. Was that what it was? When he gets, like Jacob, the same phrase. He says, at last. Like, and then when he sees, finally he's reunited with Joseph, same phrase is used. Like, at last, before he dies. Like, at last, he gets to see his son again. Adam is implying time has passed here. He doesn't, and when you go to Genesis 1, when it talks about the 6th day, it talks about man and woman being created. So again, I think you're dealing with different metaphors in one and the other. Now, some people will say, well, Genesis 2 is more of a metaphorical story. And again, you're sort of shooting yourself in the foot if that's your point, because you can't just say this is a metaphor, but then 1 is not a metaphor. So again, I think those are pretty powerful objections just in Genesis 1 itself. Like, I don't need to go outside, even into other Bible verses, to see that the author himself is sort of implying there's time passing in between each one of these things. Tommy, did you want to take your turn?
I've been thinking about this since December. Now, all right, so the problem I actually have, oh, and by the way, you said that you drink a lot of water because you're not good at talking a lot. I think you're a very good speaker, by the way.
Thank you, Tommy.
You're welcome. And my dad's very good at talking a lot. That's a very good skill set. He can teach anybody that. But I just want to say, so the problem I have with young Earth creationism is actually what my mom said. She hit the nail on the head, which is that young Earth creationists typically, I find, are extremely dogmatic in their approach to their interpretation, right? So like, they said, like, you have to interpret it this way because it's almost like fear-based. Like, if you don't interpret it this way, then everything else in the Bible is open to be interpreted incorrectly. That's a very big assumption. That's like the first issue that I have with the other issue I have with it is like, just like, I don't, on a cultural level, I don't like the sense that like, if we tell people like, hey, like, we actually believe the Earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and we like really believe that, like, it kind of makes us, I think, as Christians, kind of look stupid, because like the Grand Canyon, like, obviously took millions of years for the water to get down to where it is, and there's layers of fossils, so like there was clearly like life that was there that took millions of years to become fossils, and like it seems odd that God would just like plant that there, put all these fossils in order, and then be like, oh, I'm just trying to trick you guys.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't make sense.
That's the hard, like, getting outside of the scripture itself and talking about some of the problem I always have is like God as a deceiver. You know, like the universe has an appearance of being very old, and like, did God just make that an illusion? Or, you know, I know that there's arguments about age of the universe, and, you know, maybe at the end we'll get into those different things and talk about the different ways we study that. But that was a good point Tommy brought up, is that, you know, me personally, I think that if the universe is, you know, billions and billions of years old, I don't think it takes away. I think it increases God's power. Like the fact that we mean so much that he would let billions of years sort of happen for us to be born. You know, we are actually made of stardust. You know, stars have to be formed and then explode to create elements heavy enough to create life. Like, we are carbon based. You only get carbon from an exploding star. So we literally are born from light. Like, and that took billions of years, millions of years. And I actually think that makes God even greater. Like, I think rather than say like God just did it 5,000 years ago, if you say it did 13 billion years ago, that lessens God. This is not theology. This is not biblical. This is just sort of the way I sort of view it. And that, you know, God is like a God of order. I don't think God is a magician. You know, God doesn't act like a magician. He doesn't just like poof, 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 pull my rabbit out of the hat, you know. Jerry. Yeah, just push it.
Okay. You ever hear the creation moments on WFGB?
Sometimes.
Well, they believe in a 10,000 year.
Yeah, that's Ham, right? They have Ham on a lot.
And
that's his last
I
name.
hear it every once in a while. I'm driving in the car, and he addressed what Tommy was talking about, that the layers that they say were millions of years old were all formed at the time of Noah's flood.
Yeah, that's usually the response.
So that it really wasn't millions of years. It was only 5,000 years. But that'd be interesting if you wanted to get into that.
I mean, like I said, I was thinking of getting into that when we get sort of later on, because I don't have it at the front of my brain right now. But, you know, sometimes I can only fit so much for each class, and then I don't. But I will address that question since you guys brought it up, and we will talk about it. So,
I think it's interesting.
you're not on.
I think it's interesting in Genesis where he says the earth was without form, so there was no form, and void and dark, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he says God was hovering over the face of the waters. So was it all water?
Well, I mean, sometimes that's interpreted as just like the expanse of the empty universe.
Okay.
And
then
the earth being without form and void can literally mean an uninhabitable waste. Like the earth was an uninhabitable waste, you know? And God made it livable.
So when he created the heavens and the earth, so the earth was just not habitable.
Yeah.
But then it says, then he said, let there be light. And there was light. And then God saw the light, and it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And this is before he made the sun and the moon. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Like he just called light
I mean,
into existence.
It's a cool book. Like, I mean,
It is.
the authors of this were not stupid people. Like, this is a very well written and sort of a beautiful book. Beautiful story, beautiful narrative. Like, and
Yeah.
they say a lot. There's a lot in those verses, and it's Bill, I think, brought up last year that, when you read it all at once and listen to it, it actually sort of even follows the timeline figuratively of like what science says. Like, you can sort of visualize like how science says the earth sort of was this like volcanic waste, and then sort of the spark of life happened and it sort of grew and expanded and stuff. So I think it's pretty cool.
Ben, there's a line in the line that you read where he separates the waters from below with the waters from above.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean, the waters from above?
That's a confusing one.
It can't be the clouds.
A lot of people don't, maybe he's just referencing the blue sky. Could be heaven. I actually was doing research on that last year, and I sort of was confused by it.
One of the things we didn't touch on, because it had maybe less to do about creation, but he said, let us make man in our image. And so are we to take that as there was more than one God, or do we take that as Christians as that's the Trinity?
I mean, I think neither, in terms of, like, when we're just examining this text on its own, I don't think we should assume the Trinity because the author didn't have that thought or belief. I think when you sort of have a deeper understanding of who God is, I talked about this when we went over the Trinity like a year ago, that there is sort of that the name of God in the Old Testament a lot is plural. So I think that is a way to read it. It's not multiple gods. Like, it's not polytheism. I think it's better to assume the Trinity. But I don't think the author was saying, like, oh, I'm going to write about the Trinity in Genesis. Like, he didn't know. He didn't have an understanding at the time.
He did say plural.
Yeah.
Just the way you pointed at me was okay. Hi. I went to college in the Bible Belt in Iowa, and I had a discussion with this young guy who was trying to convince me the world was 6,138 years old. And nothing I could say could convince him. I wanted to say, do you believe in the speed of light and the light spectrum and all that stuff? It was, it was in and out 1 year. Genesis and Exodus, you can correct me, seem to have the most metaphors and simplified explanations for things, since not much about science was known back then. Do you think that the writers of these two books, since most of the people that were going to read them were pretty uneducated, probably couldn't read them, they had to be read to them, was just to simplify things?
I mean, I think you actually make a point that not necessarily to simplify it because they're uneducated, but these stories are for everyone. Like, this book is for everyone, so it's understood by everyone. And that's why I said, I think if someone reads it at face value and they just have the book, and that's fine. Like, it's fine to be read literally. Some people don't have access to, the writings of all these theologians. And I think that's correct. I think it's the nice thing about the Bible, and other than when the Catholic Church came in and sort of said it could only be read in Latin, is that it's for everyone. And like I said, Muslims, you can't read the Quran unless you can read it in Arabic, and that's the way the Catholic Church, and that's when it becomes about dogma and power, and it's not the correct way to do it. So I'm going to conclude here, but that doesn't mean you can't ask more questions. But as I've said a couple times, I think this view is perfectly acceptable. This does not affect your Christianity in any way. It doesn't make you not a Christian. All these sort of interpretations I'm going to go through, I think, are perfectly fine for a Christian to have. And the reason I say that is, we shouldn't become so narrowly focused. That's how the church keeps splitting. We get hung up on these different dogmas or these different doctrines and say it has to be this way or it has to be this way. And it's like that just breeds division. And sort of what Tommy said, I mean, I wouldn't say it in the way he said, that it's sort of like if you say you believe this and, then it makes you look stupid. It's like, I don't think that, but I think knowing these other interpretations is good, because like if you're encountering someone who's not a believer and they are very hung up on that, these other interpretations. So maybe if you believe that it's 7,000 years, you don't have to say that. You could say like, well, no, actually there are Christians who think this is a very wide held view that it's actually millions of years old. And, and then that might be like, oh, really? I didn't know that. You don't necessarily have to be like, I got to prove my belief, Another interesting note is that this isn't, I think a lot of people think like, oh, the objections to the literal interpretation has only been sort of a big thing since modern science, and that's not true. Like this has been a long time. The second generation church fathers, some of them like Origen, Justin Martyr, they believed that it wasn't 24-hour period. St. Augustine didn't believe it was a 24-hour period. A lot of the early church fathers didn't really. They said it didn't matter. Like it wasn't it wasn't church orthodoxy at the time in the early church. I think it really became to a head when the evolution debate sort of started, and then each side, I think, became increasingly dogmatic on both sides, like on the scientific side and on the sort of Christian community. And that's sort of what I'm trying to, like I said, I like the synthesis of faith and science. I think God is a mathematician, as Tommy likes to say. So if anybody have any more questions? So next week, we're going to do what's called the gap interpretation. And just really briefly, that is the interpretation that between verse 1 of Genesis and verse 2, there is a gap, like a huge gap of time. So we'll get into that next week. All right, thanks, guys.